as we wrap up the series, The Deeply Formed Life. Steve is here to talk about sex, and I'm glad that you're here. And I think this is a cool thing to talk about. I actually wanted to ask a question. When you were a youth pastor here at Cornerstone, and you talked to our teenagers about how there really is no verse in the Bible that says, "Thou shalt not have sex before marriage," how was that received by them and by the parents?
Well, the fun thing was back then we'd send out a letter beforehand to all the parents. You got plenty of those for Mar and Jack. Just invite people in, and so I would always teach that, but I would take that even further than I did in the sermon and explain that in Jewish culture there was always I think it's a chuppah, a tent that was set up right near where the wedding ceremony was, because after the wedding ceremony the couple would go and consummate their marriage, and so it would paint the picture, hopefully for high school students, that sex was marriage in Jewish culture, which is why we got to that point with that verse.
That's cool. But I'm sure he had some interesting conversations.
I got so many emails back then. I'm sure I'll get some now.
Hey, we'll put Engel's email address right here on the screen.
I'm super
That'll
good
be
at that.
So helpful. No, really, it's important to have a conversation about this, because we are not going to all agree exactly on all the nuances of this. But I really love, Steve, how you talked about what does love require. That's one of our main values as a church. And how do you think asking that question in this particular context helps us reshape the understanding of sexual wholeness and the way that we relate to others?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that question moves us past objectification, because you can't objectify someone if love is present at all. Like, I can't look at you as a means to an end. I can't look at my wife as a means to an end. I can't look at another person as a means to an end, because if love is present, then I'm looking at you, as a person, as a human. If it's not, then you become an object. And so I think that question is so important with this conversation, because if love is like this all-consuming, all-present thing with us, then especially when it comes to our sexuality, we're looking at other bodies and how their souls are connected to their bodies more than just their bodies.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that objectification that you talk about. It distorts our ability to see people as image bearers of God. What advice would you give to someone who wants to kind of break free from this pattern of objectification, whether toward themselves or even towards themselves or towards others?
I mean, I think a couple things. One, I think that the naming thing that I talked about in the sermon would be helpful to figure out why is that? Figure out what formed that in us. And I think we could all go back and look back on the things that formed us in an unhealthy manner when it comes to sex and sexuality. Another thing would probably be an approach at looking at that issue, objectification, through the lens of recovery. I think, not to say that objectification is an addiction, but there are so many ways where you can relinquish. I think objectification comes down to control. I want to be able to control you and what you do for me. So much of recovery is about relinquishing control and surrendering. And I think that's maybe after you discover what formed those things in you, then you have to relinquish the phases or the modes or the things that built those in you.
Yes.
To let those go and release those is probably the second step then.
Yeah, like an addiction. Almost.
Yeah. There's a word that I was looking for, and I kept wanting to say modality.
I wish I could help you, but I'm not that smart.
And it wasn't that. Oh. So I was going to say something that was going to sound stupid. So,
I'm glad you didn't. Yeah. We're all glad, because we don't.
Because I don't want to sound stupid.
No, I mean, you usually don't.
I might be stupid, but I don't want to sound
No,
that
you
way.
don't sound it either. Let's talk about also the connection between sexuality and spirituality. I think that's probably why this is something that we don't really talk about in church, because we don't feel like that there's a connection there. How would you say can we practically integrate those two in our daily lives? And please don't tell us that we have to pray before we have sex, because that's just so weird.
While you have, sorry.
Oh, exactly. I don't. But our past experiences may have caused a disconnect, and I think I'm a victim of that, or I'm a product of that as well.
I think the definitions that we laid out in the sermon are helpful, because sexuality is wanting to know others. to be known and to
Yes.
know others, and spirituality is to know and be known by God. And I think it goes back to the greatest commandment that Jesus gave us, to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength by loving your neighbor as yourself. It's so, everything, according to Jesus, is so connected, which goes back to Genesis 1 and goes back to this, like if we look at people as image bearers as an opportunity for harmonious relationship,
Yes.
then we start to understand how our bodies and our souls are connected, how sexuality and spirituality are connected, how people are again image bearers of God, not just resources to be used.
I love that, Steve. I love that. I love that we're having this conversation. And now, before we wrap up this series, I especially want to highlight Steve's point that we have this built-in need for connection, right? For connection with the divine, with God, and connection with each other, like you said. And I am fully aware that there are a lot of us who deal with isolation and loneliness, with lack of connection, with sometimes debilitating isolation. Maybe that's why you're connecting with us online. And I want you to know that I see you, that we see you, we want to know you, and I want you to know that you're not alone. We are fully committed here at Cornerstone Fellowship to helping you get connected. And we can start that today. I want you to experience this, what Steve talked about, this social bonding that helps meet your needs to live connected to others in these life-giving relationships. And let me reiterate our desire as a church, the way that actually you expressed so eloquently, that we would pursue a life deeply formed by Jesus, that we would love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and body, and that we would love one another, not as resources to be used, but as harmonious relationship to be pursued. Let's do that together. So I hope to see you online this week.